Well, it's lovely to be here today, and I really do want to thank Tom and the whole team for all the huge amount of work they've put into making it all happen. Very interesting to hear Angie's talk earlier, because mine's another talk about resilience. It's about the resilience of human creativity and our ability to adapt to the new and to express ourselves and create something astounding, compelling, even in the most alienating of situations. I'd like to start with something that appeared in the November 1960 edition of Popular Mechanics magazine. And it was this: the Wurlitzer Sideman, essentially the first commercial drum machine. Now, this chap here, as you can see, he's very happy with his Sideman because he's a keyboard player and he can be playing away, turn to the one side, press a little button and get an instant foxtrot, waltz, march, whatever he wants, instant rhythm section. The Wurlitzer Sideman and the drum machines that followed were a boon to keyboard players, especially those that were making money in clubs and pubs. But it was a nightmare for drummers for all the obvious reasons. And understandably, musicians around the world went on the attack, none more so than the UK Musicians Union. And they did something very clever. They pointed out this machine's obvious weakness, which is that it was perfect. It produced perfectly metric beats. And so it had none of what we call the rubato, none of the tempo, ebb and flow that you get when you have a flesh and blood drummer in the room who's expressing their emotions through their instrument. The Musicians Union said this is a robot, and they called it a stilted and unimaginative performer. Yes, so the Sideman, that wasn't the musicians' first run-in with technology, not by any means. And the arguments that were made against the drum machine were very like those that appeared at the end of the 1920s when the talkies arrived, and the Musicians' Union called talking pictures a dehumanised form of entertainment. Here's a brilliant cartoon from 1930, and what's going on here is you've got a cinema returning to sanity because they've reinstalled the pit musicians and they've thrown the dreadful canned music in the bin. And, you know, it's a serious thing that happened. There was a mass extinction of pit musicians in this country when the talkies arrived. Thousands upon thousands of people lost their jobs. And the musicians, understandably, saw themselves like other artisans in other trades where highly efficient machines could duplicate the labour of one person and basically usurp them. And that was a process that had continued apace in the 20th century and right till today, in fact. And it was certainly happening when the talkies arrived. And it's worth remembering that as the machines of mass production got ever larger and ever more efficient, the people working on them were reduced to robots in the absolute literal sense of the word, you know, workers who were merely there to feed these mighty engines of mass production. And labour in these factories became atomised as people worked out the most efficient way for humans to interface with machines. And I love this. There was also work by sort of idealists like Frank and Lillian Gilbreth who were trying to increase human happiness. And they sort of almost took the machine as their model because what they tried to do was get rid of what they called wasted motion, the sort of things, well, basically what's going on in this photo, this is from about early 1900s. This is a long exposure photograph and a woman's doing a job and she has light bulbs attached to her wrist so we can see where she moved. And then they'd look for signs of, you know, unnecessary movement and they try to iron them out to give her, well, to make her more efficient, less fatigue, and give her what they called more happiness minutes. Now, we're so steeped in the sort of products of mass production, like my computer over there. Things that are handmade, they're extraordinary to us now. And, you know, we elevate them, we put them in couture houses and living history museums and art galleries. And I would argue something similar has happened. As a musician, I'd say something similar has happened with sound. We live in what's been described as the era of transmitted music. The stuff we listen to, the vast majority of it is, you know, CDs, downloads, whatever, you know, on the TV. And, you know, going to hear a flesh and blood performer, that's a rare treat. This is Thomas Truax, by the way. It's a rare treat to hear live sound. And I would argue that when we go for handmade products, we often go for things that have got those sort of obvious irregularities that tell us that they were made by a hand and not by a machine. You know, the kind of thing you buy where the lines aren't perfectly straight and it tells you that it was, you know, hand-stitched or hand-weaved. And I would argue a similar thing happens when you compare the drum machine and the flesh and blood drummer, in that it's like the little kinks in tempo and volume that tell you that you're listening to the work of a human and not a robot. Well, I've been mulling these ideas around for a while, and I find them fascinating, but I also find them troubling, because I think to myself, you know, I look at those poor musicians in 1930 and I feel nothing but sorrow for them. But at the same time, I love going to the pictures. And, you know, I don't want to lose the experience of, you know, I don't know, the finest orchestra in the world playing the music of Bernard Herrmann while, you know, Tippi Hedren runs across the screen. I don't want to lose the experience of hearing the sounds of some dystopian alien planet in some film or other. And I think that's what was happening with recorded sound, and the talkies in particular. It wasn't replacing live musicians with something inferior, it was offering people something other. And so it's troubling to think, well, you know, how did that come out in the wash? Even today, I can't quite get my head around that. And I would argue something similar has happened with the drum machine, which I'm going to come back to later. I also felt troubled by it because I thought, well, what am I? Am I the artisan or the factory owner? I don't own a company, it's just me, I'm a sole trader. But when I go and work in my office studio, I bring in fellow live musicians, we're the artisans, and I use all the hardware I can get my hands on to create something. So it's not as clear a thing as a sort of inexpressive product. You know, when you start to talk about, you know, what are the sort of economics and the sort of social dynamics at work when you think about music. Well, anyway, all this was going through my head, and I remember having a chat in the kitchen over a glass of wine with this to a very good friend of mine, Caroline Radcliffe. And Caroline, we've played together for years as live musicians. Caroline is also a very good dancer. And she said, oh, I know, why don't you work with me on the next performance of this dance that I'm really into? And I said, oh yeah, that sounds great. And then she said, oh, and by the way, it's clog dancing. Now, those are two words that for many reasons, I can tell you right there at the end, strike the fear of God in me. And I think one of them is the fact that this is my experience of clog dancing as a kid. It was a thing that happened, you know, it was quite genteel. It would happen on a Sunday afternoon, usually with some Morris men. Is like the second act. And it seemed to be about something pastoral, about recreating some supposed lost Albion, you know, that was somewhere, I don't know where it was, but it was definitely somewhere out in the countryside. And as an urbanite, this wasn't a music that I could connect to, although, you know, it's a perfectly fine way to dance. So I thought, oh, blimey, when she mentioned clog dancing. But then Caroline got up. I remember she did it in the kitchen the first time. She got up and she started to do the opening steps of this dance. And I was absolutely astounded by what happened. Because she stood there and her arms became really stiff and her body became really still, not an ounce of wasted motion. And her face became incredibly expressionless. And this is what she did. Now, Caroline had been researching clogs, and she informed me about a lot of things. Clogs, as quite a lot of us know, were the work shoes of the men and women who worked in the cotton mills of Lancashire and beyond. And the dance that Caroline was dancing is a dance that's called the machinery. Now, this dance is astounding. It's been handed down since the mills closed by brilliant dancers like Pat Tracy, who sort of borrowed it from women who worked in the mills. And interestingly, some of my ancestors worked in these Lancashire mills, so this is sort of very dear to my heart, this story. And this dance was devised by women who were working in the mills and they were copying the machines around them. Now, to cut a long story short, got really into this, and we went to Quarry Bank Mill and on the Cheshire-Lancashire border, and we went and recorded all the machines there. And I said, yeah, we can do something where we put these steps back with the machine, so we sort of recontextualise clog for ignorant people like me. And you know, here's, for example, the governor, which is used to keep the machines in perfect tempo. And then we also made some sound recordings, which got me very excited. And there were so many things about the sound recordings that I found striking. Their richness and their sort of rhythmic properties, and also the fact that they were so bloody loud. And so I can remember at the end of the session, I said to the curator, that's really loud, isn't it? They said, oh yes, well, HSE, you know, we can only have 3 of the machines on at once because of noise regulations, but there would have been like 10 or 20 of those running when the mill was going at full pelt. So here were the women, because this is a women's dance, here are the women in the mill, in these sorts of conditions, very cramped, unable to stop for a moment and lose pace with the machine, or they'd lose their job, or worse. And they couldn't even hear themselves speak. The only thing they could do was tap their feet, and that's what they did. And very cleverly, they tapped their feet to mimic the machines around them. And so they weren't sort of trying to create, you know, some other place, some sort of mystical escape place. They were actually almost, if you like, coalescing with the machines around them and creating something new and wonderful. Now, the dance started off in the mill itself and then soon sort of hit the free and easies where they used to sort of circulate and relax. And it became a highly virtuosic thing where the women tried to be as close to the machines as they could. And I mean, I found this dance astounding on so many levels. One, just because it looks so astounding, and you know, and because it's an example of our cultural history that's bound up with mechanisation, not about some past that was some kind of agrarian past. And also because everything about this dance and its inexpressivity and its sort of roboticness reminded me of something much closer to home.
We are the robots. We are the robots. Я твой слуга, я твой работник.
And so, you know, I thought that these sort of electro pioneers and the early techno people were the first people to embrace sort of dehumanisation. But no, the women of the mills had sort of, you know, beaten them to it by about 80 years. And, you know, and I look at that dance and I see the echo of Caroline's dance in this. And I also note they have no wasted motion either. And I'd say the same goes when you think about the fate of the drum machine. Because, of course, as we all know, something very interesting happened with the drum machine. It got embraced because of its inexpressivity, especially the sort of descendants of the Sideman, like the the TR-808, which was a sort of very much beloved by the people in the early 80s, early 80s, who were sort of embracing what we'd call sort of early techno, and none more so than the people in Detroit. There was a whole, you know, a lot of our dance music you can trace back to what was happening in places like Detroit. Now, as I'm sure you all know, Detroit was the motor city at the time. There is a thing called Detroit automation. The production line was born there, automation was born there. And, you know, this is a modern production line, but you can imagine at the time, it was people working on production lines. And it's not surprising that the music that they were creating reflected the environment that they were in. Here's some very early techno where you can really hear the drum machine at work.
Stepping on the gas, accelerating fast. My cosmic car, my cosmic car.
So I love that. I love the fact that that's happened twice in quite a short space of time. People have used machines and embraced their dehumanization, as the MU called it, and made something beautiful. And it was very empowering, you know, in both cases, particularly with the women. I think that is so empowering that they managed to express themselves when they literally couldn't leave the pace of the machine. So anyway, all this got me thinking, because I make things, and I was thinking, well, how can I sort of reflect this in other ways in my work? And so I have a couple of projects on the boil that sort of demonstrate that. One, which I'm just going to tell you about, because I haven't got time to demonstrate it, is a new thing I've been making called Ventricle, and it's going to have a little show and tell quite soon in the Marlborough Theatre. And very, very briefly, Ventricle is a machine that keeps pace with me, and it's very simple. What I do is I use a stethoscope to measure my heartbeat, and then once I have the heartbeat registering, and it knows that it's sort of got the attributes of a heartbeat, it's actually a little bag, and the bag is about the same age as my heart, because from an anatomical point of view, I find that quite strange that there's this little leather bag that's been out there being opened and closed over all these years, and my heart's been doing it, you know, 60 times a minute, and it's going to be moving. And hopefully, I like it, so I want it to feel like your sort of heart on a slab. So that's Ventricle, but I thought it'd be nice to actually physically show something as well today. And that's another thing that I use a lot in my performance, which is the idea of using gestural interfaces like my trusty theremin to control machine sounds. Now, if we could go over to the other computer, please. While we're going over to the other computer, in case any of you haven't seen the theremin before, and also because I need to tune it up, I'll show you how it works. It's a wonderful thing that can register how close I am to these two aerials. And this affects pitch and this affects volume. So I'm just going to tune it in. Oh, actually, yes. Well, do you mind pressing 1 as well, please? Yeah. There it is. That's perfect. That's tuned in. Okay, so yeah, basically this is what a theremin. If you haven't heard a theremin before, this is what a theremin sounds like. So there's nothing foursquare about it. It's all about my human gesture. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to sort of, reverse the roles and have the machines following me? So if you could press 2, please. I'll just show you what I mean. And if you could press escape, and we'll see the. Thank you. So that's the theremin being controlled. I was thinking, right, so it's happened in the cotton mills, it's happened in Detroit. Where is this going to happen again? Sort of people sort of almost empowering themselves by saying, right, I can't fight this, so I'm going to somehow create something beautiful with it. Thank you. And I thought, well, the most likely candidate is, of course, the call centre. This is obviously a stock photograph because they're all incredibly happy in this call centre. I thought, yeah, call centres, fascinating places because, yeah, of course, conditions here far better than conditions in either of those places. But of course, you can't leave the machine. Every second of your time and your loo breaks are monitored. And the relationship between the call centre and the cotton mill is actually quite eerie when you look into it. Oh, seem to be going backwards. Sorry. For instance, I was surprised to discover that many of the call centres are opening on the sites of old cotton mills. And what happened with the cotton mill? They exploited shipping, the network of the time, to find cheap labour in India. What's happening now, we're exploiting the network of the time, the internet, sending the call centres out. And so there's all these sort of very, very strange parallels. And actually the HSE did actually at one time call some of the worst call centres the dark satanic mills of our time. So I thought, right, well, is anything going on in the call centres? I don't know. It's far too early to say. But I did a little bit of rooting around, and it made me strangely optimistic.
I want a t-shirt. You get nothing. What's going on the... I want a t-shirt. Hello? Yeah, it's Craig from Optus. How you going? That's good. I'm after the person who controls the remote telephone.
So there you go. That's the amazing resilience of the human spirit and our creativity and our ability to make something beautiful in absolutely any situation. Thank you.